Okay, well, let's get started. So, thank you to everyone for tuning in to today's conversation. Ask the author how to design strategic conversations. Insight's really excited to partner with our portfolio company, Blinkist, to create a modernized book club series where we bring the author to you and give the opportunity to ask them questions about the concepts mentioned in their book. And what better way to kick off this conversational series than to host Lisa K. Solomon, TEDx speaker and author of Moments of Impact, How to Design Strategic Conversations that Accelerate Change. Before we get started, please note that we will be sharing a recording of the webinar before the end of the day, so keep a lookout for an email notification from me, Christina from Insight. We'll also be reserving time at the end of the presentation for Q&A, so we encourage you to enter your questions in the side panel throughout the presentation, and we'll answer them at the end. But enough housekeeping for now. I'll pass the mic over to today's speaker, Lisa K. Solomon.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us this morning. We are excited to kick off this series to bring books to you and to make them relevant to your work. And I hope that our time this morning will help give everyone listening a better understanding of what it means to design strategic conversations and what their opportunity is, whether you are an entrepreneur, a business leader, someone in sales, someone who is responsible for driving growth in your organization, why you need to think of yourself like a designer, and the opportunity to use the conversations we have as a mechanism to generate new ideas, to scale impact, and to make a broader difference more globally. So I'm excited to bring you some concepts today on how you all can do that. So a little bit about me. I not only am an author, but I teach executives, MBAs, undergrads, and even K-12 about how they can learn the principles and practices of design to create a better future. So I do that at Stanford at their D School. I work with organizations like Singularity University. And along the way, I try to codify my work in books like Moments of Impact, which we'll be talking about today, Design a Better Business, which has practical tools that you can use immediately to think about growth in your organization in a different lens, and many, many articles to try to bring these practices to life. I fundamentally believe that we are all capable of designing better futures. And one of the reasons why we don't think of ourselves like designers is because we just haven't been taught. And I think that it's critical in a time of increasing change and complexity that we can change the way we think about how we engage each other, regardless of our role within the organization. Fundamentally, I believe if you make decisions that affect other people, you are a designer. And I would like everyone on the call to pause and see how that resonates with you. Do you think of yourself as a designer? Is that something you've ever tried on? Or do you think design is just relegated for people with art degrees or know how to make things look beautiful? I think that design is a practice that will help drive growth in times of increasing change and complexity. So I want to encourage you all to start with that provocative question, to really think of yourself as a designer and to see what's possible if you do. And we're going to cover what I mean by design in a minute. And as we go through just a little bit of an overview of the book, I want you also to be thinking about an upcoming strategic conversation that you might need to design for. So this could be a board meeting that you have coming up. This could be an offsite. This could be an executive team meeting that you have or a strategy session. But I know that all of you have something coming up on your calendar that has been called a meeting that is going to take up real time that you probably don't have in order to discuss something of significant importance that will affect the future of your organization. And I would posit, even though I am not I do not have a crystal ball about what your future holds, I would posit that you are going to have this important conversation in the middle of a calendar that looks something like this, right? Filled with back-to-back meetings that are taking up your time, where you're ping-ponging back and forth. All the while, you have this urgency to think more deeply about the future of your organization, and it's all you can do to just keep up with the day-to-day. And I think that this reality that we are all living in, of where strategy fits in our busy lives, where we have white space to think about the bigger possibility is just in shorter and shorter supply. And I think that this phenomenon is so prevalent in our lives. I've called it calendar rage. And I think we're all experiencing it to some degree. And it's even worse than that. So not only are we sort of sandwiched between these meetings back to back, we're also bombarded with information. And I can imagine that some of you have been in meetings that have PowerPoint decks that look something like this, where you just have, one framework being presented after another, one chart after another, where you're trying to be involved in the strategy of what's happening in your organization, but it's just coming at you like a fire hose, right? So that's one way that we're taught to manage meetings, is through information overload. On the flip side, in more recent years, we've sort of over-indexed on the brainstorming method, right? Let 1,000 flowers bloom, where all ideas are good ideas. And we have this very generative flaring session where we're asked to ideate on the future of our organization. And then we're somewhat surprised and even more disappointed to realize that all of those great ideas never really went anywhere. So we have these two modes that we think of managing our time, either through death by PowerPoint or this overabundance of ideas. A lot of times we try to reserve the most important room to signify the significance of the conversation. So for those of you that experience a lot of boardrooms, I know they often look something like this, right? Like a dark, handsome conference room where there's literally no air to breathe. And again, we're asked to think really generatively about the future. And we wonder why we feel so tired and so disengaged. And I would argue that all of these could be fixed with different design choices, something that we can do. And so what do we do when we're sequestered in these like big, dark conference rooms? Well, oftentimes we get so frustrated, we sort of pull out our phone and we try to self-help underneath the table, or we're trying to actually get the work done because we know we are going to be up until midnight because we're just getting our time wasted. And I would argue that this is a form of meeting rage that may be brewing in all of you listening today. And this is not unique to you. There's been now more studies done on just how much time we waste in meetings that are unproductive. Harvard Business Review recently did recently had an article on this, and they studied one multinational organization, and they found that this one organization, for the standing weekly executive meeting, cost the company 300,000 hours of employee time just to get the executives ready to meet with each other. And you can see from this chart, if the center is the executives meeting each other, then the circle around them are all their VPs that are spending time preparing information to get the executives ready, and the circle the next circle out are their directors, and then the next circle out are all the people under them. So we are conditioned to waste time on meetings that don't really advance the strategic agenda. And so Moments of Impact was created to really fix this phenomenon. The ultimate punchline being, we don't need more meetings. We don't. In fact, we need to design moments of impact. And those are really creative and collaborative strategic conversations where we're actually sourcing new ideas, we're recombining half-baked ideas that are hunches that would benefit from getting diverse opinions, from getting alignment around the things that really matter, that ultimately get above the fray and drive positive change. And I'd be curious to know, for all the people on the call, how many of you actually took a class on designing strategic conversations? And in Moments of Impact, we talk about the skill of bringing people together from diverse backgrounds, asking the right question, having the ideas marinate, and come to an aligned strategy as the most important leadership skill you've never been taught anywhere. So I'd love to hear from people in the audience who are listening, if in fact they've ever had a course on strategic conversations or got any guidance on this. We sort of think of it as a golfer that learns how to drive straight and get their shot on the green, but actually never learns how to putt. We think it's critical and we think it's overlooked. Why? Well, we live in unprecedented times. This is a world filled with adaptive change and increasing uncertainty, often referred to as the VUCA world, filled with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, that's teeing up new kinds of strategic challenges that are old ways of solving them just are not equipped to handle. Many of the ways we've been taught to think of strategy have to do with frameworks that come up with a single answer. And in fact, we need to think of these much more as mysteries that need time for discovery and time for questioning as much as answering. And that's really where the power of design comes in. And what we say in Moments of Impact is that in a world filled with increasing volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, leaders and entrepreneurs need to approach strategy, impact, and innovation much less like mechanics, where you're taking a discounted cash flow model or the 4 Ps of marketing or whatever framework you learned in business school to churn out a number or a single point of view. And instead, we need to think more like designers, where we're comfortable in the ambiguity, where we're willing to ask different questions that start with why or what if versus driving towards the right answer. So this is the power of design. And I want to just quickly give my definition of design, because I know that design is something that's wildly misunderstood. And even though design thinking has become a lot more popular in recent years, it's still not something that often starts with strategy. And so I want to connect those two ideas of what does design have to do with strategy. So first, let me start with what is design. So many of you probably have something in your life that you would call well designed, that you would say, wow, this delivers great utility to me and great joy. Maybe it's your new iPhone. Maybe it's your Dyson vacuum cleaner that picks up dirt from the floor and does it quietly without a bag and without a cord, and it delivers incredible amazement. Maybe it's a special designer chair that you paid a lot of money for so that your employees will sit comfortably for longer periods of time, get more work done, while the breathability of their back allows them to feel comfortable in doing so, right? We pay more money for these products. We call these things well designed, and these are not alone in the things in your life that are well designed. I encourage you to think of what you would consider well designed. But we call them well designed because they do 2 important things. They deliver functional utility and emotional engagement. And a lot of times it's this emotional engagement that's often left out. We think of things driven by engineers to get a job done, and we don't think about the user experience and how they feel while they are experiencing the product or service, or in this case, conversation. So we can see that a lot of times we over prepare for meetings with content, and we don't actually think about what do we want people coming to the meeting to feel. Do we want them to leave excited, engaged, motivated? How do we create an experience that sets them up for success, not just gives us the opportunity to go through our agenda? So this is a very different approach to thinking about how you design conversations. And I want to say that although, as I mentioned, design is increasing in popularity, unfortunately, bad design is still pervasive. And I think there's no better example than this one. Maybe all of you have experienced something like this, where you've tried to get the package opening of something that you really, really need in your life. So in the case of this very, very frustrated customer, they're just trying to open up the light bulb to get to the light bulb. And what's happened is that design and the idea of design creating emotional connection has not gotten to the entire organization. In fact, the packaging people got a very different memo. Maybe their memo was make it cheap, make sure that the light bulb doesn't break from the warehouse to the store, make sure it can actually go on the shelf. But in no point did they ever get the memo that said make sure that the customer can open it easily so that they can get the thing that they paid for to work for them with great delight. And I think that this is really a metaphor for what happens in a lot of our meetings, where people spend a lot of time thinking about the content and what they want to share with others, but they haven't thought about the wrapping, right? They haven't thought about the room that you should be in to create a spirit of openness and generative thinking. They haven't thought about even what food should be served, or how you might want to send a note in advance to help people be successful. And I think it's that attention to detail that can really make or break if the conversation goes well. This phenomenon is so powerful, and I'm sure all of you have experienced it at some point. There's a name for this too, and it's called rat rage. And it spikes a single day of the year. So if we add context, right, called Christmas. And on the day that your kids are looking forward to getting their presence, you end up looking like this, so frustrated that you can't actually get to the thing they've been waiting for. So you hack your way there with a machete or very sharp knife. You probably end up in the hospital, and that's how your Christmas is spent. Again, the metaphor holds for the day that your organization's been looking forward to, whether it's the all hands meeting or the team offsite, and they're so excited to really get motivated about why they're working at the organization. And instead, they're getting bombarded with information that suggests that it hasn't been designed for their benefit, right? So I live in Silicon Valley, the land of innovators and entrepreneurs. So in the case of hacking rap rage, we have great entrepreneurs that came up with good ideas where you actually fix the problem with a new product. And if you look closely, you'll see that this product actually requires the product to open it. So that's probably how we get to viral growth. But the point is, you shouldn't need a special tool to get to the stuff that matters. And we can take a page from the company that really put design on the map as a strategic capability, Apple, that went ahead and designed the packaging to be as beautiful as the product itself. And that's my hope for all of you. How do we think of conversations not just through the lens of an agenda, but really through the whole experience? So as leaders, what responses do we want to trigger? Do we want to trigger rap rage where they're so frustrated that they completely check out and waste time? Or do we want to trigger absolute delight where they hold on to the experience for as long as possible? And I would ask all of you listening to say, how many of you still hold on to your Apple packaging and why? Right? Because they designed it that way. So I want to share a few pointers on how you can think of yourselves as designers of strategic conversations with this in mind around designing for engagement and for emotion. And then I want to open it up to your questions and perhaps even case studies. I'd love to hear what's a conversation you have coming up and how we could solve it together. So the first and probably most important principle I want to share as you think about designing conversations, which is to think of what is the purpose that you are even bringing people together for? And in the journey of innovation, of coming up with new ideas, I would argue that there's really only three core purposes for bringing people together. They may take different flavors, but at the start, it's really about building understanding first. That's the first conversation you want to have. Why are we even doing this? What is the purpose of spending money on trying to create a growth plan or trying to create something new? What is it that we're hoping to achieve? What is the urgency? You have to establish alignment around that before you get to the next part that we want to rush towards, which is shaping options. This is really the what if, right? Well, we could do this, or we could do this. What if we went to China? What if we went into a different market? What if we changed from a product to a service? We love ideating on new ideas and solving problems, but if we haven't gotten fully aligned around the why, then that is often time that gets wasted because you're not in alignment. Finally, once you've built understanding, once you spend time shaping choices, then you can figure out how to actually implement and scale. That's the time for making decisions. A lot of times we think that a single conversation can do all three, and I want to argue that perhaps at best you can do two. Perhaps you start with building understanding and you move towards shaping choices. But as you can see from these arrows that diverge and converge, particularly when you're talking about big conversations that affect your future, you really need time in between to allow people to do research and to really get them to understand what it is that they're trying to design for. The next principle I want to share is the importance of creating urgency, of framing issues in a way that really gets people to lean in and want to spend their time, particularly in a noisy, busy world. A lot of research has come out recently to suggest that even though we are more connected than ever, our tools and technology are actually slowing down our productivity because we are bombarded. So if you want to design a conversation that's really going to get above the noise, you need to figure out how to create enough urgency, this notion of a controlled burn where you don't have a wildfire on your hands because you've left things unattended to for too long, and it's not so safe that nobody's engaged at all. And so I would encourage you to think about what question are you asking to get people to get on board? How are you really getting them engaged? And to do that ahead of time so that you know going into the conversation that people are really, really going to have some reason to pay attention, some reason to get involved, to be engaged. And the third one I want to talk about today is this notion of designing for engagement, full emotional engagement, not just intellectually, but emotionally as well. We're taught to keep emotion out of the boardroom. And that's why we often get these very, very safe PowerPoints that literally lull people into death. I would argue that emotion is where great ideas come from. If your organization, if your executive team, if your board has energy for something, whether they're nervous about it, there's important data and insight there. Likewise, on the other side, if they are excited about it, there's important data there as well. So we should encourage people to get involved, to get fully engaged. That will help us come up with new ideas and will help us make better decisions. Most strategic conversations look something like this, where the engagement is essentially a flat line over time. I would encourage you to think as a designer to actually provoke engagement, to provoke emotion, to bring things into the room that people can really lean into and get excited about. There's all kinds of ways that you can do that. You can do that by doing activities with them where you bring them outside and ask them to literally stand with the point of view that they have. And that's an example in the upper left. You can get them to do that by bringing technology into the room. So when you're talking about a new technology, they are not just talking about it in an abstract way, but you're actually demonstrating it live so people feel the full power of it. You can get someone to visually record the conversation so it engages their visual brain in a different way. You can get them to tell stories about it in the bottom left. That's a story of an entrepreneur talking about his son who created a new hospital service, a robotic hospital service to clean, to reduce diseases. You can play games, another very, very powerful way that's often overlooked to generate new insights and engagement. Or you can just bring in other different kinds of tools to get people involved. All of these are design choices you can make to make sure that people are engaging in the full way possible, to go from a at best so-so meeting and instead get the most of the people around the table. So these are just some ideas of how you can think of yourself as a designer about making choices that trigger responses in others, and to think differently about a new design choice that you might make using these principles. So with that, I'll pause after I gave you that short cliff notes of moments of impact of how to design strategic conversations to accelerate change. And I'll welcome conversations or input from the folks on the webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa. And everyone, please feel free to enter questions into the side panel. We do have a question from Bill. How do you adapt/interpret the principles of strategic conversations for the role of the organization change manager?
Well, that's a great question. So this is someone that is responsible for helping adapt the organization. I would say that learning how to design strategic conversations is a critical individual and organizational capability that they can build. So we actually have a chapter in the book towards the end that says overcoming the yeah buts, as in, yeah, that sounds great, but that would never happen here. And there's three pretty pervasive yeah buts that I imagine everyone on the call can really relate to. The first yeah but is, yeah, but I don't have time for that. Yeah, but I have short-term results I need to deliver on. So that's this drive that we're all pulled towards around delivering on the plan that we promised last year. So we're all in execution mode. So that's a really tough one that gets in the way of organizational change. The second big yeah but is politics, which is pervasive, right? That we have new ideas, but they get trapped in the organizational antibodies around protecting budgets and people. And the third is that we've never really been taught how to do this. And so our premise is that by learning how to design strategic conversations, you can actually flip that around. You can take a more long-term, future-oriented approach by framing questions in the right way to get people to have different kinds of conversations. You can take the negative politics and you can turn that around to be productive collaboration by engaging diverse perspectives in a more co-creative, a generative way. And you can build the organization capacity to do this on a regular basis. So I think the practice of learning how to design strategic conversations is absolutely critical to organizational change.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And from Rich, Lisa, great presentation. Some kudos, thank you. How do you best show the potential benefit of a better conversation to a skeptical client?
That's a really great one. In some ways, you have to figure out how to ignite your own controlled burn on that one. You know, there's two basic philosophies on it. One is that you frame it around the carrot, right? So you could say, okay, well, this is how conversations would benefit you if you did it this way. It's often a harder sell than the other, which is the stick. Or, you know, maybe another better metaphor that we often talk about here is, are you designing for vitamins, right? Because this is good for you, or are you designing for aspirin, right, to fix your headache? I think oftentimes the more skeptical one is to maybe say to your client, hey, go look at your calendar and go count the number of hours that you wasted in pointless meetings in the last week or in the last month. You know, and then calculate the cost of that. Because the thing about meetings and our time spent in wasted meetings is that we often don't really understand just how much it costs us, right? If somebody went into our wallet and took $40, we would not think twice of saying, what are we getting for that $40? Or give me my money back if you did not deliver on something of value. And yet we don't have that same philosophy on time. And the crazy thing about time is that we actually can't get it back. We can get money back for sure, but we can't get time back. So part of what we hope with Moments of Impact and raising the urgency of using time more productively and looking at it through the lens of design is to make both meeting goers better consumers of how their time is being spent and saying, hey, look, I see that you've taken an hour or 2 hours of my schedule. Can you tell me what this is about and why you really need me? And to help those that are calling meetings feel more responsibility for using the time of others more effectively.
Wonderful. And do you have any interesting case studies that you might want to share with the group?
Absolutely. And the book is actually filled with case studies. We interviewed over 120 people for this book, not only practitioners of designing strategic conversations, but experts in design and strategy and in conversation. And what we found, which was interesting, is that there was lots of books on each one of those on design, strategy, and conversations, but none about how to design strategic conversations. And many of the people that we interviewed didn't even realize what they were doing necessarily was a craft or a practice. They just knew that the old way wasn't working. One of my favorite examples is a woman by the name of Karin Hansen, who for many years was the VP of Design and Innovation at Intuit. Intuit was a very design focused conversation where they were really learning how to think about design as an organizational capability to help make them more innovative. And about 7 or 8 years ago, Karin was asked to have an offsite with the top 16 executives to help develop a mobile strategy. So a great example of a big adaptive challenge, doesn't have a single right answer. Everyone on the executive team had their own point of view about what mobile was and what it should be, but they were not aligned in any meaningful way. And so as a result, the organization was very siloed and budgets weren't being used effectively, and they weren't getting leverage from the different organizations, from the different departments. So Karin designed a 2-day offsite at Half Moon Bay, which is not far from here. It's a beautiful area. And instead of just having the same conversation that they would have had in the boardroom at Intuit, right? That often happens where you spend a lot of money to go somewhere beautiful, but you end up really just having the same conversation in a different venue. She instead had all the executives first interview customers that were using mobile applications to run their business. So they're typical small, medium-sized customers, dog walkers, daycare owners, folks that were very eager to use this emerging technology to help them become more efficient and more connected with their customers. So they had all the executives interview these customers to understand what life was like for them. Just to get a baseline of what their customers' experience was going through, to establish some empathy. And then in the afternoon, she sequestered the cutting edge technology at the time, which was a BlackBerry, right? That was the dominant player. And she gave them all first gen iPhones and Androids and had them go to the heart of town, Half Moon Bay. And they all worked on a strategic, they had a sort of like an amazing race adventure. They all had to do a scavenger hunt using this new technology. And what she wanted them to do was to experience mobile, not as an abstract chart of a hockey stick growth projection, but instead as a technology that was present and now. And she had them use an early version of Translate, early version of geocaching and GPS and maps. And when they got back, all the teams had experienced it firsthand. And she said the entire tone had changed. Everyone realized that mobile was not some abstract concept, but that mobile was present. And in fact, if they didn't start making some different investments immediately, that they would be way behind and it would be much, much harder to catch up. And that really launched their mobile strategy. And shortly after, Brad Smith, who was the CEO at the time, said, look, every dollar we spend on R&D is going to be mobile and cloud first. So it just goes to show you the power of what happens when people experience something viscerally at the same time.
That's great. And do you have maybe just a small tactic or tip to get started?
Absolutely. Well, first is you got to start with a real issue. So, if you have, that's why I opened it up saying if you have a strategic conversation in mind, if you have an offsite coming up, or you have a board meeting, or you have something of significance, take a look at the agenda and ask yourself, is this agenda filled with people talking at one another? Yes or no? And if it is, then, well, you have an opportunity on your hands. And I think the easiest thing you can do to change the tone is to instead don't start the conversation with an overview of the agenda. Start with a question that you want everyone to be thinking about. And if you really want to actually have them ready to engage with that question, you may even want to start by sending out the communication ahead of time. Hi, everyone. Really looking forward to seeing you next Thursday for our offsite. In advance of the conversation, we want to let you know that we are going to be spending time thinking about this important question. We want you all to come in with your perspective on why this question is important, on how we should be thinking about it. Notice, not necessarily the answer, right? You want to get them steeped in it. And if you want them to do some homework, you could say, it would be fantastic if you all spend a minute or two, have some conversations with customers so that you come in informed, not just with your opinion, but with some real data that will help us advance this in an important way. So you're giving them some homework to do to get them fully engaged, to get them thinking about it, so that when you come to the conversation, people are ready to really interact with each other.
Wonderful. And then another question, how much of your principles work equally well for digital meetings compared to face-to-face?
Yeah, it's a great conversation. We definitely wrote Moments of Impact to be an in-person one, and I will say we also know that all of you suffer from meeting rage and limited time. So we have a starter kit in the back that you can just jump to just give you the principles and some things to try, some things to do. And if you want to go further, that you can ask. And I think that a lot of those ideas in there would apply to the digital version as well. Digital's tricky. It's much, much easier to check out. Maybe some of you listening right now are multitasking as we speak. So you have to think that much ahead of time around what is the digital experience and how do you really set people up in advance to make sure that they will stay fully engaged. You want to establish a reputation of starting on time, of ending on time, of getting others to participate throughout. So maybe you want to let them know ahead of time, hey, I'm going to be calling on you at certain points in the conversation so that people really feel like their time is being well spent, whether it's in person or digital. You want to set some really important housekeeping. We're doing a good job on this one. Like, hey, everyone, if you're not talking, be on mute, because nothing is more infuriating when you're trying to hear someone and they're at a cafe or there's a barking dog in the background. There's just no way that you can be fully attentive. So you want to pay attention to all of those details that will lead to a really engaging experience.
Awesome. And often leaders have an idea of where they want to go and want buy-in and consensus from the team instead of dictating X or Y. Do you have
Right.
any tips for designing a strategic conversation to build consensus on a topic?
Yes, it's a great, great question. And I would say a lot of the A lot of the gotcha meetings that don't go well are when leaders get up there and say, hey, I really want to get your feedback on this. But in reality, they've already decided on what the direction should be. So we call it like fake participation. That can be extremely demoralizing to people because they just feel like, why did you even waste my time to begin with? You already knew what the answer was. So I think the first caveat is really make sure you want consensus and you don't just want buy-in on your idea, right? Like, so one way to do that is to make sure you spend time on what I would call a design criteria. What are the elements of the decision that we need to really align on in order to make sure that we've landed in the right place? So before you go right to the answer and you try to strong arm people, you could say, what are the must-haves? So this new idea or this new direction that we're coming at, what must it have? And I do this, by the way, for the conversations that I design. I create a design criteria for the conversation. So for example, I might say it must be engaging, or it must be future focused, or it must be provocative, or it must generate excitement, right? Well, then that will help me dictate what choices I'll make. So you have a list of what must it have. Then you can have a list of what should it have, right? So these are the really nice to haves, but it's not mission critical. Then you could have a list of what it could have. So these are, like the extra bonus. And probably as important as the must, what won't it have, right? So to be clear about what's going to make sure that when you get consensus, everybody sees themselves as being a part of the criteria towards success, right? So that it's more objective versus you're having one person's ideas being thrust upon others where they're feeling bounded that they have to say yes. And incidentally, if you're interested in learning more about that tool, in my second book, Design a Better Business, we've created about 20 different design tools that are all available via Creative Commons. You can go to designabetterbusiness.com under tools, and they're all available to you to take a look at with facilitation guides.
That'd be great. And from Rich again, at our organization Kaleidoscope, we're focused on the importance of trust to be able to have conversations. Is explicitly building trust between participants a key part of your method? And if so, how do you go about doing so?
Absolutely 100% yes. I think trust is one of the most important and misunderstood currencies of our time, particularly as it relates to organizational change and culture. We actually have a whole chapter in the book called Engage Multiple Perspectives. There's two critical ingredients to that. One is making sure that you really have diverse perspectives that are being represented around the table. And the other is how you actually go about engaging them so that they feel safe and that they feel like that they can bring their best ideas and their full selves forward. A lot of times, leaders do what I call they make the mistake of having what I call an audio video disconnect, where they say things like, we really want to have a transparent culture, or we really want to make sure that this is based on trust, but their behavior suggests something totally different, right? So that they only have, the same 5 people in a room making the decisions. When they say we really care about participation, people see that and they say, well, we don't really believe you. So I think it's absolutely critical to examine the values and principles that your organization says that you stand for, and then what are the behaviors that actually bring those to life. And that will help establish trust. And strategic conversations are a key part to doing that. I can give you another just quick case study on that. Several years ago, I was asked to design a 2-day offsite for the top 60 leaders of a very large financial services firm that was quite conservative. And I did a bunch of interviews ahead of time to understand what the different stakeholders wanted out of this conversation. And one big theme that came up was we really want to create a place that's safe to speak. We're the kind of culture where there's 5 meetings before we actually get in the room. And by the time we get in the room, everything is so watered down, it's a waste of time anyway. We really want to have an honest conversation. I said, okay, well, that's interesting that everyone's saying that, and yet somehow the culture is not supportive of that, that somehow other behaviors have been normed. So I made a design choice and I created these safe to speak cards that had very clear behaviors of what would indicate a culture that made it safe to speak. So there were things like asking a provocative question or sharing an early idea without all the data to back it up, or um, bringing up, voicing an idea even if you're not the most senior person at the table. And I created these cards and I essentially gamified the first part of the conversation. Everybody got 10 cards, and anybody could reward somebody else, regardless of their title, if they saw behavior that was modeling the safe to speak. And I will say, getting back to an earlier question, people were pretty skeptical. They're like, that seems pretty juvenile. This is a really important conversation. But I will tell you, it completely changed the dynamic of the entire conversation. And by the end, people were so into it that one of the more junior person actually got all of the acquired the most cards and won a special prize. I was asked to come back a few months later to design another conversation for them, and they didn't need the cards. The entire way that they communicated with each other had changed because they started norming different behaviors. And it didn't matter that the cards were the sort of scaffold to help them get there.
Wow, that's a great story. Thanks for sharing. And another question, do you use the concept of psychological safety in your design process?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, that's another part of engaging multiple perspectives. So essentially, if you've invited people to the conversation, you want to really understand how can you create conditions to allow them to bring their best selves forward. And that could be anything from, do you have different levels of experience in the room, to different kinds of backgrounds, to do you have introverts and extroverts? So for example, when you ask people to generate ideas, do you give people a few minutes alone to generate ideas to make sure that those that are less comfortable voicing their ideas publicly have a chance and a mechanism to get their ideas out there? All of those are really, really critical. To getting back to one of the earlier slides I shared about what does the room look like, right? Boardrooms can be really intimidating. So we have a whole chapter called Set the Scene, where we talk about different design choices you can make sure that people feel in a more open stance. Finding a room that has natural light, maybe getting chairs that are more comfortable, maybe starting off with an activity that levels the playing field. I start off almost all of my workshops, not ones that I'm doing via webinar, although sometimes I do, in an interactive exercise that gets people in a more comfortable stance, right? When you ask people to show up for a conversation that has the chance to meaningfully affect the future of that organization, people are on high alert. And because we are naturally wired for survival, our first response is often, am I going to get fired today? That is not usually a stance of psychological safety, right? So your job as the designer is to make it very clear what the intent is of the conversation and how you hope that all people show up to be fully engaged.
Awesome. Thank you. So I think those were the questions that we had for today. Thank you so much, Lisa, for joining. This has been a wonderful conversation. And thank you to Blinkist for being an amazing partner in this series. So as I said before, stay tuned for an email. I will be sharing a recording of this webinar later. And for joining the webinar today, you're eligible to receive a 30% discount on Blinkist subscription, which I'll also send via email. And thank you everyone for joining today. Hope to see you next time.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Bye.